everyone, and welcome to our first major event with the University of Tasmania College of Arts, Law and Education and the Australian Institute of International Affairs. I'm Kim Boyer. I'm the State President of the AIIA, and we're very, very proud and pleased to have friend of Tasmania, friend of Australia, Gareth Evans with us to talk tonight. We've also got a Zoom audience, all on the board up there. Could the Zoom audience please ensure that your mics stay muted during the presentation? And when you want to ask questions near the end, we'll try to manage as many as we can, but please type them on the Q&A rather than try and speak. Sorry about that. Before I start, I want to in welcoming you, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Palawa people, and also the Indigenous people in the places in Australia where we are broadcasting. These people have cared for the land on which we meet and on which we broadcast, and this land always will be, and has never been ceded. It's very important for us to recognise that. From an AIIA perspective, I think it's really important to welcome Gareth Evans. Tonight, Gareth's going to speak on the world past COVID, but he's also going to be talking about his book about being good international citizens. It's great that we've got such a good live audience here as we're starting to come back after COVID. I think that I'm going to very, very briefly, because Gareth told me I can't steal his time, basically hand over to Gareth. And then in Q&A, Catherine Goetzer, who's one of our partners from the University of Tasmania, will be managing Q&A before I close the proceedings at 7 o'clock. Okay, so really Gareth doesn't need any introduction. He strides tall in the world of international relations and foreign affairs, both in Australia and internationally within the UN and other organisations. He's a great friend to Tasmania, to the AIIA, of which he's a fellow, and to higher education, as has been a Chancellor of ANU. He's told me not to cut into his time, so I won't. So Gareth will talk. Q&A, as I said, will be managed by Catherine, with questions online and alive from here. I'll then end off just before 7 p.m. and Gareth will be available, very importantly, for you to buy his book, thanks to Fullers who are in the foyer, and he'll sign them as well. So over to Gareth, and thank you all for coming.
Well, thanks so much, Kim, for your very generous invitation to join you all tonight, which is a real pleasure and privilege, as always, to come down here. So the world order is not in very flash shape at the moment, I think is the obvious starting proposition. The world is more fragile, it's more volatile, more dangerous a place than has been the case for really a very long time. The devastating human and economic consequences of COVID for so many countries should, I guess, have been a global wake-up call, reinforcing a sense of the absolute indispensability of international cooperation in preventing and responding to cross-border existential risks. But the pandemic seems at least as often to have reinforced go-it-alone nationalism, playing too often politically into nativist suspicion of outsiders, and economically into reduced confidence in international supply chains and the more open trading system, which has contributed so much to global prosperity over recent decades. Then Russia's legally and morally indefensible invasion of Ukraine in February this year has had even more alarming consequences for world order, with Putin's utterly unprovoked border aggression amounting, as we all know, to the most egregious head-on assault on a fundamental principle of global order since 1945. With the horror of it all compounded by the Russian military's commission of mass atrocity crimes, and also Putin's very alarming revival of talk about the usability of nuclear weapons. The invasion has had a dramatic economic as well as security impact, contributing to exploding energy prices worldwide and increasingly alarming food shortages. Add to that the tensions posed by China's now quite undisguised challenge to the United States regional and global supremacy. Add to that too the increasingly illiberal and institutionally vulnerable character internally of so many of the world's self-described democracies, not least the United States itself, which have been the mainstay of the post-World War II rules-based liberal international order. Putting all that together, there's far less optimism, far less reason for optimism now than there was in the pre-COVID period just 3 years ago about the achievability of sustainable global peace, security, and prosperity. So all this poses multiple challenges for Australian foreign policy, 5 in particular that I would normally talk about. First, navigating our own relationship with the United States in an environment where, for all the importance that we rightly attach to our alliance and for all the insurance we might think we have bought with all our past down payments in blood and treasure, Vietnam and Iraq and elsewhere, the reality is we can simply no longer assume, if we ever could, that America will be there for us, whoever is president, in circumstances where it's not also the case that American interests are very obviously also under threat. Second challenge is resetting our relationship with China in an environment where we have to walk a tightrope, manifestly beyond our competence in recent years, whereby on the one hand, we continue to push back against unacceptable Chinese overreach, both externally and internally, but at the same time, get along with China, recognize the reality both of our enormous economic dependence on that country, and also the fact that geopolitically it's here to stay and will no longer accept subordinate status regionally or globally to the United States or anyone else. The third challenge is strengthening and making more obviously mutually respectful our relationships with our key Asian and Pacific neighbours, in an environment where those connections have not in recent years had anything like the attention they deserve. Given our geography will continue to matter much more than our Anglosphere-focused history in our future. A fourth challenge, I believe, is restoring diplomacy to centre stage in the conduct of all our international relationships, in an environment where the decline in influence of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has been really quite sad to behold. Totally marginalised by the Morrison governments in particular, absolutely obsessive preoccupation with defence and intelligence, and manifest failure to appreciate the crucial role of traditional diplomacy in advancing peace and security. There's really quite a lot to talk about in relation to those 4 challenges, including the extent to which they're likely to be more effectively met now by the new Australian government. And I hope it's not just my biases showing when I say that first impressions in this respect have really been pretty reassuring. But for present purposes tonight, given that my topic, my assigned topic, is the role that Australia can play in the current world order at large, the particular challenge on which I want to focus tonight is the 5th in my list, by no means the lowest priority, but what I would call the challenge of restoring our global credibility as a good international citizen. What I mean by being a good international citizen is essentially being a decent country, one that others respect, trust, and want to emulate. Being not just wholly inward-looking and wholly self-interested. Being a country that genuinely cares about poverty and conflict and human rights, atrocities, health, epidemics, pandemics, environmental catastrophes, weapons proliferation, and other problems very often affecting people in places very far away from our own shores and very often having little or no direct immediate impact on our own traditional security and prosperity interests. This is a dimension of our foreign policy which I'm afraid has too often gone missing in Australia in recent years, but which in my view is really quite crucial, both to our sense of self-worth as a nation and our international standing. It's also a dimension of international relations, which in recent years has too often gone missing from the larger global stage, with many other countries behaving nothing like good international citizens. While there was a significant period of revival of international cooperation in the immediate post-Cold War years, which we can all, I guess, remember, and occasionally since, as with the G20 response to the global financial crisis of 2008, and at least now in the Western response to Ukraine. But there's not much left of that spirit now. When we look at the UN Security Council, we look at the role being played by many of the UN agencies and treaty organizations, when we look at the World Trade Organization, when we look at most of the world's regional organizations, we desperately need to help restore that habit of dialogue, that spirit of cooperation, at a time when this has really never been more critical, not least in the management, which I'll come to, of the three great existential risks to life on this planet, as we know it: pandemics, climate change, and nuclear war. In responding to the question of what role Australia can play in the post-COVID world order, what role we can play not only in protecting and advancing our own immediately obvious security and economic interests, but in making the wider world in which we live safer, saner, more just, more equitable, more decent. My answer is for us to be a role model, a model good international citizen. We're not insignificant players, after all, globally in terms of our economic size, ranking 12th or 13th in the world, nor are we insignificant in terms of our military capability, but we have to recognize that we're never going to have the weight in either of these dimensions to be a really major player in major geostrategic security issues, or more than a marginal player in the global economy. Where we can be a major global player is as a role model for decency. Australia has played that role in the past, particularly visibly. I think I can reasonably claim, although I have a certain self-interest in this claim, during the Hawke-Keating government period, with key examples being our leadership role in the Cambodian peace process, in the anti-apartheid campaign against South Africa, the Uruguay round of international trade negotiations, bringing to conclusion the Chemical Weapons Convention, initiating the treaty banning mining and mineral exploration in the Antarctic, particular resonance here in Tasmania, and in creating significant new regional economic and security dialogue forums, regional forums, including APEC and the ASEAN Regional Forum. We've ranked in the past right up there alongside countries like Canada and Norway, who won lasting plaudits for good international citizenship initiatives, including in Canada's case, it'll be remembered, sponsoring the Ottawa Treaty, banning landmines, and also sponsoring the International Commission process, which I was involved, which led to the birth of the responsibility to protect principle against genocide and other mass atrocity crimes. In Norway's case, launching, I think many of us can remember, the Oslo Convention against cluster munitions. Australia can play that role again, but we've got a lot of catching up to do. To me, there are four big practical benchmarks which matter above all else when one is addressing any country's record as a good international citizen. Being a generous aid donor, doing everything we can to protect and advance universally recognized human rights, doing everything we reasonably can to prevent the horror and misery of war and mass atrocity crimes, and to alleviate their consequences, their human consequences, including for refugees and asylum seekers, fleeing their impact. Being an actively committed participant in attempts to meet those great existential risks posed by health pandemics, climate change, and nuclear war. Australia likes to think of itself as a good international citizen, and from time to time, not just in the Hawke-Keating years, we have deserved to be so regarded, but only from time to time. And against these benchmarks, I think it has to be said that our overall record has been patchy at best, lamentable at worst, and for the last few years has really been embarrassingly poor. On overseas aid, we've been the worst performed of any rich country donor in terms of the decline in our generosity over the last 5 decades. On human rights, where what happens at home very much matters abroad because nobody likes a hypocrite, our record has been at best mixed. Pretty strong, for example, internationally on apartheid and our support in principle for the responsibility to protect against atrocity crimes, but pretty weak, I think it would have to be acknowledged, on Israel's role in the occupied territories, more recently, for example, in Myanmar. So too with our contributions to international peace and security. In peacemaking diplomacy, we've largely gone missing in recent years, that have played some important roles in the past, and I've already mentioned Cambodia. I should add that I do certainly think that our strong bipartisan response to the current horror story in Ukraine, where we really have no very direct or immediate security or economic interests at stake, but where the issues of international law and morality have been absolutely crystal clear, I do think that strong bipartisan support has been a classic example of good international citizenship. As international peacekeepers, we've always done very well when we've been out in the field, and for many, many years we had not just hundreds, but in fact thousands of Australians playing those roles around the world. But we've accepted far too few such obligations in recent years. Currently, my understanding is that we have less than 50 personnel out there spread over 4 separate missions. In meeting our responsibilities for refugees and asylum seekers, our record at times in the past has been a very proud one. Malcolm Fraser's response to Indo-Chinese refugee outflows, Bob Hawke's response, which will be well remembered, to Tiananmen massacre. But in recent years, I think it's been little short of shameful. With my own party, I'm sad to say, joining the race to the bottom, and still, I'm afraid, submerging its better instincts on issues like offshore processing. In meeting the final benchmark, the 3 great existential risks to life on this planet as we know it, again, I have to say Australia's performance internationally has been pretty underwhelming or worse in recent times. In climate change, manifestly, we've scored a dismal fail, with our response grudging, minimalist, and earning us an unenviable international record as a climate laggard, not least in our own Pacific neighbourhood. In the case of pandemics, we've achieved, I guess, a bare pass internationally, though not ever matching our promise with actual performance in the South Pacific. And with our financial contribution to COVAX, the global program for distributing vaccines equitably, which is way behind its last year's target, our performance has been among the least generous, I understand, of any developed country. On nuclear weapons, the existential risk issue with which I guess personally have been most actively involved, now extraordinarily the subject of new, quite serious threats by Russia, which can't be entirely dismissed as bluff. Australia has, in fact, in the past played quite a major role in global agenda setting, not just on nuclear non-proliferation, but on disarmament, in particular with the major international commissions, the Canberra Commission initiated by the Keating government, and the Japan-Australia Commission on Nuclear Weapons initiated by Kevin Rudd's government. We can play such a role again in the future, at least if those on the non-Labor side of politics, and also quite a few on my own side of politics, can overcome their lovesickness with nuclear deterrence and the joys of sheltering uncritically under whatever nuclear umbrella we believe the United States might be inclined to hold up for us in a crisis. A good start would be for us to support, which we haven't done in recent years, the growing international movement for universal adoption of no first use doctrine by the nuclear armed states. But that will need not only the election of a Labor government, which we've now achieved, but also one that has restored its mojo on these issues. the jury on that, I'm afraid, is still a little bit out. My hopes are very high. My hopes and expectations are high that the new Labor government will do much better than its recent predecessors on all these fronts. And we're already seeing some obvious policy changes, most obviously in relation to climate. But a major change of direction across the whole spectrum of issues that I've been sketching out cannot simply be assumed. There are many competing claimants for any government's attention, many competing domestic priorities. When it comes to issues where there's no immediately obvious direct return to our national security or national prosperity, the response one often gets from political hardheads and bureaucratic hardheads, both in Parliament and bureaucracy, as I can testify from my own cabinet experience, the response is really that this stuff is really just Boy Scout stuff, something you do from time to time if you're under some particular pressure domestically to act, or if you feel you do have the resources which you might be able to make a little bit of a difference. But it's not the real business of national government. My answer to that cynicism, that skepticism, which is pretty endemic in the political class, the senior bureaucratic class, my answer, which I have spelled out at some length in my recent little book, it's really a bit exaggerated to call it a book, it's an essay, Good International Citizenship, the Case for Decency. My answer to that kind of cynicism, which I hope will be seen as compelling, is that we have both a moral imperative and a national interest imperative to be and be seen to be a good international citizen. The starting point in making the case for good international citizenship, not only for Australian policymakers, but for those anywhere else, is simply that this agenda, this is the right thing to do. That states, like individuals, have a moral obligation to do the least harm and the most good they can. Answers will, of course, vary depending on one's philosophical or spiritual bent as to what's the source of that moral obligation. But the striking thing is just how much convergence there is around basic principles, whether or not one's approach to ethics is religiously or humanistically based, and whatever the cultural tradition in which one has been brought up. We should think of advocates for different approaches to moral reasoning, whether Christian or any of the secular philosophical traditions, utilitarian, Kantian, Rawlsian, or anything else. We should think of them as approaches which are simply climbing the same mountain from different sides, as a British philosopher recently put it. In their different ways, the different ethical traditions, both religious and secular, all point in essentially the same direction, demanding core respect, demanding at their core respect for our common humanity. And recognition of and respect for our common humanity is the moral core of the concept of good international citizenship. But the second part of my case for good international citizenship is that the returns are more than just warm inner glows. I've long argued that being and being seen to be a good international citizen is not just a moral imperative, but a national interest imperative as well, in its own right, deserving to be ranked right up there alongside the traditional duo of security interests and economic interests. Decent behaviour can and does, I believe, generate hard-headed, practical national advantages of a kind that do appeal to realists and political cynics, as well as to idealists. In fact, I argue there are three kinds of hard-headed return for a state being and being seen to be a good international citizen. The first return is simply reputational. The country's general image, how it projects itself, its culture, its values, its policies, how in turn it's seen by others, is really quite fundamental importance in determining how well it succeeds in advancing and protecting its traditional national interests. Over many decades now of active international engagement, I've witnessed over and over again how this soft power does matter. It matters in determining whether one is seen as a good country to invest in and trade with, a good country to visit, to study in, a good country to trust in security terms. It matters being seen as a good country to support for responsible international positions and to work with in responsible international decision-making forums. Sweden's not a bad case for the hardheads to ponder. Universally seen as an absolutely squeaky clean good international citizen right across my decency spectrum, a country with which no country is remotely reluctant to deal. Also happens to be, I would suggest not entirely coincidentally, one of the world's biggest conventional arms suppliers. You do get returns of a kind which appeal to the cynics and the skeptics and the hardheads for being seen to be above suspicion and being genuinely decent. Second return, hard-headed return from international citizenship, good international citizenship, is reciprocity. Foreign policy makers are no more immune to ordinary human instincts than anyone else. And if I take your problem seriously, you're that much more inclined to take mine. The reciprocity here is often not always explicit or transparent. Subtlety will often be an advantage in achieving it, but I don't think any practicing diplomat will be unaware of the reality and the utility of that dynamic, and no government policy makers should be oblivious to it. The third return is simply getting more stuff done, making progress on issues where the whole world, including us, does ultimately benefit, like climate change, but where the national costs for many players might seem for a long time to outweigh the benefits, and where the necessary collective international action is accordingly often very hard to achieve. Simple point is that the more states that have a cooperative, collective, good international citizenship mindset, the better the chance of these things getting done. My argument that good international citizenship is both a moral imperative and a national interest imperative, that's possible to be simultaneously both idealistic and pragmatic, might be thought by some political leaders to be too complicated a story for them to tell. Well, my answer to them is to remind them of a quote I often use in a number of different contexts, the famous admonition of the Scottish Labour MP Jimmy Maxton in the 1930s. If you can't ride two horses at once, you shouldn't be in the bloody circus. This leads me to the final leg of my argument for good international citizenship, being an overtly core element, not just an add-on, a core element of our foreign policy. And this brings me to what I call the politics of decency. Behaving decently internationally, even when there's no, again, obvious, immediate or direct security or economic return, is a lot more politically palatable and saleable than most policymakers here in Australia as elsewhere tend to assume. On all the available evidence, the problem in delivering decency lies not with the negative attitudes of our people, but our governments. Australian polling conducted by the Lowy Institute over the last 15 years, there's another poll out today, which I haven't yet had a chance to have a look at, but I'm sure it's consistent with everything that's gone before. That Australian policy, and my understanding is that this has been reproduced in most of the other countries we like to compare ourselves with, shows very clear and often quite overwhelming public support for just about all my benchmark tests of good international citizenship. Aid is sometimes seen as the exception. And it may appear to be an exception when we look at some of the Lowy findings that have been quoted very enthusiastically by government ministers on the other side of politics in recent years. But it all really depends on how the question is asked. 2017 Lowy poll, which has been very widely quoted, told respondents that the current aid budget was $3.8 billion, and it recorded fully 73% of respondents describing that as too much, or at best about right, and certainly not remotely justifying any increase. But when the researchers asked the question differently the next year, not offering any particular dollar amount, but just asking respondents what they thought the percentage of the national budget was devoted to national aid and what they thought it should be. The answers were very interesting. They thought the amount being actually spent was $14 out of every 100, 14% of the national budget. And I said, no, that's too much. We can't accommodate that. But then when they're asked, what do you think we should be spending? They said, $10, 10% of the national budget. Sounds about right. The reality was that we were spending there 80 cents, 0.8% of the national budget. So we had a situation where people thought we were spending 17.5 times as much as we actually were, but were prepared to spend 12 times as much as we actually were. So I don't think we should underestimate the inherent generosity and decency of the Australian public when it comes to aid, or for that matter, anything else. So my final point is simply this: when governments have taken strongly principled, good international citizenship positions, they've had no obvious difficulty in taking the community with them. The nervousness that so many of them have shown has not had any obvious political justification. Decency really is good politics. There may be room for argument as to whether these issues will ever be sufficiently central, sufficiently salient to win elections, although the success in the Australian election just completed of those campaigning for better climate policy, for decent climate policy and less indecent government behaviour generally, that success should give sceptics some pause for thought. Certainly there's no evidence, of which I'm aware, that taking a strong stand for decency in the conduct of international relations against the kind of benchmarks that I've described ever lost anyone an election. So the bottom line is that a country with Australia's general record and reputation as an energetic, creative, middle power, which has at many times in the past played a world-leading role in international diplomacy, should be setting our sights much higher than we have in recent years. We have, after all, just one planet. We're a global community, and our political leaders should give more weight than too many of them have done to what Abraham Lincoln famously called the better angels of our nature. Countries can be global leaders, not just as a function of their economic or military right, but by force of their example. It's time for Australia once again to play that role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. My name is Catherine Götze. I'm Senior Lecturer in International Relations here at UTAS. So I'm the UTAS side of this event. Those who've been to the last event on Tasmania's Gateway into Antarctica maybe remember me. And I have the pleasure to moderate this Q&A. I think you have been preaching here to the converted. I think everyone will agree with your analysis of the past foreign policies and your hopes for future foreign policies, but I'm pretty sure people still have a lot of questions. So who would dare to shoot off? Right away. Yes, please. I'm just would you please quickly say your name so that we know who we're talking to?
Peter Davison-Galley is my name. I'm a retired academic in philosophy. But my question has nothing much to do with that. Want me to, have I got switched on? Yep, right, I can pitch my voice. I'm an ex-infantry sergeant as well, so I can make it as loud as you like. You advocated us being a role model as a nation, and a scattering of examples was given as to areas in which one could be a role model. What strikes you, if one had to pick and choose, what would strike you as the most salient, the most important, the most significant ways or areas in which we could have most bang for our buck in trying to be a role model?
Well, I think the most immediately obvious one is climate, which is an issue of just huge salience right around the world, and on which we are perceived as having been anything but a role model in recent times. So there are quick wins there, frankly, in just getting back to the international mainstream, taking seriously targets, both long-term and short-term, and taking seriously the policy actions that go with it, including in the South Pacific, where that is an issue of huge salience for all those island countries, which was ignored unhappily at our peril. So I'd put climate probably top of the pops. I think in terms of aid and development assistance, that's another one where there are pretty obviously quick returns. I mean, it's really quite tragic to see the decline for a country of our wealth down to, I mean, the global standard is 0.7% of GDP or gross national income. We're now tracking for below 0.2%, which puts us right among the tail end of the OECD developing countries. It's expensive to get ourselves back on track on that, but it's very obviously a need that needs to be satisfied in our own region in particular, but also other far-flung places. And just turning that around would be of quite high visibility and quite high practical impact on countries that matter. There are some other, more obviously political issues, which I think would have an immediate impact were we to change some of the public postures we've been taking in recent years in particular. And I have to say the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine issue is very obviously one of those where there is very widespread community views, a very widespread global view, not shared by our friends in the United States government or a few others, but by many others, that there's much that's going horrifically wrong in terms of respect for human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, and for Australia to recently step back a little bit, not support a US-generated statement was quite an important symbolic step to take. I'm not suggesting it'll have any particular impact on the ground in a way that aid does or the way that our engagement in the climate issue would, but it's an example of a response to a peace and security role internationally, which does have a high degree of visibility and a high degree of traction in terms of biting on our reputation and our credibility. The issue which I'm worried most about in terms of whether we will do the right thing, and which is still generating a huge amount of international attention, and where we're being treated as a role model for all the wrong reasons, is our treatment of asylum seekers and refugees, where I mean what I said when I said there was just a race to the bottom in the context of Tampa and subsequently. And while I fully understand the case for boat pushbacks to deter the smugglers, provided you've got arrangements in place with your neighbouring countries so nobody's being pushed back to just drown in someone else's waters. But the notion of offshore processing really has been incredibly inhumane, the way that's been carried out. And it just seems to me to be an unnecessary part of the regime if people smugglers are to be deterred. I think pushbacks do that enough. After all, there are people coming in every day of the week on visas and overstaying their welcome, seeking asylum. Something like 30,000 people have come by air. What the hell it is about boats that make those people so much more dangerous to the community than people arriving by air, I've never been able to understand. But this is an issue which has become so embedded into the DNA of our both sides of politics. It's not an easy one on which I can see us quickly moving to shift, but it would send a very significant signal if we did. But I mean, I really do think we can make a contribution right across that spectrum of issues which I described. The nuclear ones, if we came out in strong support of no first use, that would be a very significant role for a well-known ally, umbrella beneficiary, so-called, of the United States nuclear deterrent, for us to say, no, we don't want to rely on nuclear weapons as a first option, only at most as a retaliatory option. That would be a position that none of the US allies have adopted. It's made Biden very much more cautious than he was otherwise inclined to be. And for us to change our position on that would send a hugely significant signal. So, I mean, I could really work my way through every one of those items and say it matters, because I think it does. I think reputationally, some individual things matter more obviously because they've got more visible traction than others, but they're all collectively important in creating an impression that we're a decent country, prepared to do the right thing, not just because of some immediate security or economic return.
Thank you. There's another question over there, and I have another microphone here if someone else wants to come after that.
My name is Rajan Venkataraman. As many years ago, I was an officer with the Foreign Affairs Department. But my question is about the war that Australia has just been fighting for the last 20 years, and no one seems to mention. We went into Afghanistan following our allies there. By all accounts, we committed war crimes while we were over there.
Sorry, you're talking about Afghanistan?
Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And then we abandoned the country to the tender mercies of the Taliban. What lessons do you think Australia should be learning from the experience of those last 20 years?
Well, I didn't think it was a bad call for Australia to initially join the 9/11 response way back when. But the engagement since then has been of a pretty mindless character, following the United States down its low footprint path, its insufficiently intense engagement, and then having to face the reality of the withdrawal in circumstances where protection for women and kids in particular could no longer be guaranteed. It's not a happy story. I mean, Catherine, this is your area about peace building, and so you might want to make a comment yourself. But when you take on these responsibilities of intervening militarily in a country, even for the best possible reasons and with the best possible legal cover for doing so, which the US and its allies did in Afghanistan, there's a huge responsibility that goes with that to follow through and to ensure that you just don't leave that country in as bad a shape as you found it. And I don't think our record, I make no criticism of a lot of the good people on the ground who are trying incredibly hard. I'm not talking about some of the soldiers who arguably, subject to legal process, misbehave themselves on a catastrophic scale. But ordinary Australians, have there as elsewhere performed admirably, but without a real, framework for what it was they were doing, what they were trying to achieve, without any, coherent, effective attempt to, get the Afghan government cleansed, reformed, credible, effective, get the Afghan military similarly operating. It's just been a very, very sad story, and how you put the pieces together again, I don't know. But I don't know, Catherine, do you want to add anything to that? You're a peace building guru.
Well, I would reformulate it as another question, which I have. So if no one else want to go, or there's one up there, then maybe I'll ask my question after yours, so because guests always first, but then I would also have a little last one.
My name's Maria Riedel, and you signed my graduation papers for ANU. Your thoughts on reclaiming PEDA and your part in saving the Franklin, and why can only Labor take Australia to that sort of leadership?
Well, my role in saving the Franklin is well remembered down here, and remains a fine example of the dangers of a sense of humour in a minister. Whatever you do, don't call me Biggles, I think was my comment at the time, and Biggles I was thereafter. Look, we did a pretty heroic job in saving the Franklin, relying on the external affairs power, the treaty power, to exercise Commonwealth power in a way that was extremely unpopular. It needs to be remembered. Down here in Tasmania, won us no friends at all, won us no seats in the election, lost us some. But we did it because it was the right thing to do, to preserve the environment. Unfortunately, it was too late to save Lake Pedder. Too late now, I guess. I don't know, unless there's some chance of restoration, which deserves to be considered. I don't know. You know better than I do. But look, these environmental issues, domestic environmental issues, preserving not just national heritage, but world heritage, is a responsibility that any decent country takes seriously. And we've had a mixed record over the years, Australia. I mean, governments on both sides have had their moments of credibility and and an admirable behaviour, but it's not been consistent. And I just agree with you that this is something that ought to be a very high priority for any government.
Are there further questions? So we have 10 minutes left. I just wanted to point that out, just to invite those who have further questions to make them short. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd be interested in your observations about Australia and the Non-Proliferation Agreement, given that, assuming that the submarine acquisition goes ahead, we will be a non-proliferation signatory using weapons-grade uranium to power the subs, in contrast to some others like the French who use a lower grade uranium. What complications do you envisage in working through those issues in terms of the non-proliferation regime?
There would be a non-proliferation issue if we were replacing regularly the fissile material component of those subs and had an onshore processing facility to enable us to do that. Because, of course, if you have that facility, you have the potential to create weapons-grade material, and you're right up there in the potential proliferation zone, and you're creating precedents which are uncomfortable precedents for other countries that you might wish to deny, being in that category. The particular proposal for these submarines is for highly enriched uranium in a particular closed system model, which does not require, extraordinarily technically for those of us who don't get the technology of this, it's just extraordinary. They don't need to be touched for the full life cycle of the submarine, 30 years plus. So you can put weapons grade material into them, seal it up, and have no capacity whatsoever or need whatsoever to do anything by way of refueling them, replacing it, which would expose you to that claim of non-proliferation. The international treaty laws is pretty silent on the treatment of material for nuclear submarine propulsion, and it's very important that as part of this enterprise, Australia plays an active cooperative role in developing in Vienna with the International Atomic Energy Agency a new protocol that will address these issues. And as we speak, I know there are Australian diplomats in Vienna working on just that issue. I mean, there's a lot of arguments to and fro about nuclear submarines, but this is an important one from a non-proliferation point of view. And if I thought for a second that we were prejudicing our non-proliferation credibility, our disarmament credibility, by going down this path, then I'd be quite a fierce opponent of these subs. But I think the argument has to take place on other grounds. I don't think that's a serious one. So I hope that's a credible answer. Sorry, who else is?
There was one more question. We'll come to your question right away, but there's also the, we just noticed that there are a lot of questions from the online public. So I would like to take at least one of them first, maybe. Okay. And then so one question that was asked in several forms was concerning your idea of the reset with China relations, and also with a perspective on the Russian-Europe conflict. So what is this fine line that has to be walked there in engaging with such a powerful neighbor?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any issue about the Russia issue. It's very clear just how comprehensively at odds with any kind of legal or moral decency Russian behavior has been. And I don't think there's any alternative but to take a very strong stance in conjunction with the rest of the world on this. The issue there, I guess, is whether we should be making a noise for Zelensky, the Ukrainians, to be more visibly prepared to negotiate a peace than they are at the moment. I'm very reluctant to ask that of them in circumstances where they've suffered so much and where the moral odds are so overwhelmingly in their favour. The difficulty about that is that we're looking, unfortunately, at a more likely war of attrition, in which there's going to be a lot more immiseration, and I suppose at some stage some hard decisions are going to have to be made as to what can in fact be put on the table in a negotiation. But Putin is so obviously far from meeting his objectives at the moment that it's very difficult to imagine him being satisfied with a peace on anything like even the current line. So that's a tough one, but I don't think there's any argument or should be any argument.
Well, I think the
about
question is
treatment.
rather in the sense of if we engage with such a powerful partner economically, for instance, we create dependencies of the form Germany is experiencing now with Russia that make it very difficult to set lines. And that with respect to Australia-China relations. So where is this fine line that we have to walk?
Well, for us, a much bigger issue is China, and it's one on which, we're much more masters of the destiny of this situation than we're ever going to be in the context of Russia. So I'm not going to offer any gratuitous advice as to when the Germans should be, turning off their remaining sources of winter important energy from Russia in order to tighten the screws. I mean, it's a very tough call every which way you look at it. But for the moment, I think the message has to be support the Ukrainians, hang on in there, and just hope to God that this dynamic works itself out. But the China reset is incredibly important for us to get right. There's an awful lot that China has done that's been completely indefensible in the last few years. It's militarization of the South China Sea and generally more aggressive posture there. Obviously, a lot of its internal behavior and squashing democracy in Hong Kong and perpetrating manifestly crimes against humanity in Xinjiang and continuing the excruciating pressure it's putting culturally on Tibet. All these things are deeply, deeply unhappy. And China's behavior, the wolf warrior diplomacy, the squeeze that it's put on Australia because it saw us as a very vulnerable way of doing stuff in response to our criticism that it couldn't do the United States because it was too big and ugly. All of that stuff demands a continued pushback stance and quite a tough position, and not being willing to take too many backward steps. But there's a big but on the other side of the equation. We do have to recognize, as I said, two realities. One is that China's just a huge continuing economic partner, 30% plus of our exports, hugely mattering to our economic future. And also the geopolitical reality is that China has an entirely legitimate claim to have its own space, strategic space, I think, in East Asia. It has a legitimate claim to be no longer simply a rule taker, but a contributing rule maker in the institutions of global order. And it has a reasonable ground for objection against, the United States position, which is we're not going to sacrifice for 1 second our primacy, that China is going to remain forever subordinate. And I think we just have to recognize that to push this too far is just unsustainable in principle and very much against our own interests. So we've got to again ride two horses. We've got to both push back and get along with China. And there are ways of doing this, and you can calibrate your response. Whenever you're in deep doo-doo with another country, what you have to do diplomatically is try to work to find issues of common interest, common ground. And look, in this good international citizenship space that I've been describing tonight, there are a number of issues, climate preeminently among them, where there is high-level potential ground. I think there are others as well, which people mightn't have thought of. I mean, peacekeeping. China has actually been a very responsible player in global peacekeeping. It's got quite large numbers of troops in all sorts of places and not obviously pursuing self-interested national goals and doing it because it's the right thing to do. It's far more actively engaged than any of the other P5 countries in that respect. I haven't given up on China being a rational and credible participant in nuclear, serious nuclear arms control negotiations. They're so far behind the Russian and American stockpiles at the moment that there's so much, bellicism coming out of the United States and elsewhere against them that they're obviously now engaged in a nuclear modernization and expansion program, but they're still embracing a no first use position. They're still formally adopting a minimal deterrent position. And I think on that basis, there is room certainly for dialogue. So I think the new Australian government is doing the right thing. They're not rolling over backwards and saying, we're completely accepting that we've got to restore the relationship on China's terms. They've been very, very clear about what we're unhappy about. But they've at the same time started a dialogue, and it's incredibly important that continues. And I think in the context of the the 50th anniversary next year of the 1972 restoration of relations between Australia and China. There's a goal to work towards, which will get our relationship back on a much more even footing. Other countries in the region are managing this better than we are. I mean, Japan's got all sorts of reasons to be totally angst-ridden about China, but is handling it just so much better. And you know, South Koreans to some extent. I think we just need to recalibrate, step back from some of that extreme rhetoric that has characterized so much of our posturing in recent times, recognize what the real interests at stake here are, and try to maneuver a way through it in a way that doesn't make things worse.
Thank you. Maybe you want to come to your question, and then we will have a last one from the online, and then we unfortunately have to wrap up.
Thanks very much. Jerry White's my name. I was really pleased to hear you say about the importance of climate change. And it was a sense of relief with the Labour government and the Teals, the independents, and the stance that they're likely to take. But a cursory reading of the Labour policy, this government's policy, shows that they're still quite happy to go ahead with coal mining and open new gas extraction around the country. When do you think the rest of the world will realise what the true policy is of this government? And what advice would you give to national and state governments in terms of taking real action?
Look, I don't think they're in the slightest bit happy about continuing with coal mining. There's been a source of incredible internal, angst within the Labor Party because of the Hunter seats and all the rest of it that have, and some of the Queensland seats where this has been a huge issue. But look, community sentiment has so comprehensively moved on that subject that other than as, just a residual transitional mechanism, not closing things maybe as fast as one otherwise might because of anxieties about baseload capacity and so on. Other than that, I think what you're seeing quite visibly from the new Labor government is quite a different approach from, the one that you were hinting at, that is still a sort of mindless enthusiasm for coal. There's anything but in everyone that I talked to, desperately keen to find a way of managing that transition. Gas is inevitably going to have to be part of the transitional strategy for some considerable time. And it's bad, but it's not as bad as coal as we know. And it's a resource that we have in abundance, and we can certainly be part of the business of getting gas into Europe at the moment, which will be a very important part of increasing Germany and other countries' capability of resisting the Russian aggression still in Ukraine. So, I mean, there's real complications on multiple fronts. I mean, when it comes to nuclear, I've never been a vital bodily fluids sort of person. I'm deeply anxious about any kind of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. I'm very, very passionately opposed to nuclear weapons, but I've been willing to. But nuclear is so hard to justify economically. The upfront costs are so gigantic, and there's still so many unresolved waste disposal issues that's not part of the solution. And renewables are getting there fast, but we're not going to get there fast enough with renewables alone. There's got to be these transitional strategies, and I think that's what you're finding from the Labor Party, a really serious appreciation of that. I'd like them to move a bit faster, as many people would, the Greens would, the Teals would, on the short-term target. And I think they probably will, but probably just wait a year or so on that for a new dynamic to come into play, rather than asking them to do a backflip on a position that was really quite hard fought and hard won within the party. I think we'll see further movement on that front before too long.
So when you came here, you asked that we start at 6 o'clock real time, not UN time, which is always much later than the announced time. I would like to finish UN time because we have one more question, which I thought was really interesting on our chat here. And that was what lessons Australia can draw from its former experience in peacekeeping in Cambodia, Solomon Islands, to engage in new peacekeeping roles, for instance, in Myanmar.
Well, there's no peacekeeping role in Myanmar at the moment. It'd be a warfighting role.
Which we all would hope that Australia could take.
Well, responsibility to protect might justify military intervention under the various criteria that I and others have identified for that, but it's not going to be legally doable without Security Council approval, and that's not going to be forthcoming so long as China and Russia are taking the positions they are. So, you know, if it did come to any kind of negotiated peace in Myanmar with a requirement for a peacekeeping force to stabilise the situation with the consent of all relevant parties, yes, I think Australia should be in there, boots and all. But it's too big an ask to ask Australia to, you know, to go and do another exercise of the kind that you might be here contemplating.
Well, thank you very much. I think there are a lot of questions left. I would suggest that we collect the questions that were on the chat. There were a couple of more. We forward them to you, and maybe you can then decide to answer by email or other ways. I thank everybody to have come this evening. As Kim said, and we'll say again, the book is outside for sale by Fullers, and you have the last word, as always.
Thank you, Catherine.
All right.
I don't think it's working, but I'll talk really loudly.
Yes,
Oh, it is. Okay, good. Gareth, thanks. Inspiring, questioning, making us uncomfortable, but also seeing a potentially light at the end of the tunnel. A good Labor man. So thank you very much. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Greg, for sorting us and the tech people. Thanks to the online people, and thanks to everyone for coming. On behalf of AIIA, I'd like to do a little quick promotion. Firstly, as an organisation, we'd love to have you join us if you aren't already a member. Secondly, our next event is with the Canadian High Commissioner,